Hello and welcome to this Scots Stories video. I'm Kirsten and thank you so much for watching. Today's story relates to two late 17th, early 18th century women who never knew each other and who ended up on opposite sides of one of the defining series of events in Scotland's history. However, their stories do act as some sort of strange, slightly warped mirror of one another. Firstly, a high-ranking woman of Edinburgh who did not act in the demure fashion expected of ladies in the early 18th century. Rachel Chiesley paid a cruel price for her outspoken nature. Now, Rachel Chiesley grew up between the two family homes. One of those was Dalry House, which sits about a mile out to the west of the city centre, and the other home was in Old Bank Close. And the closes are these little narrow alleyways that run, many of them really quite steeply, off the Royal Mile. And we're standing here at the moment on the Royal Mile, that main street of the old town of Edinburgh. And Old Bank Close, although it doesn't exist anymore, was on the opposite side of this lawn market section of the Royal Mile here. And while it's not here anymore, you can maybe see just behind me to the right of my head there is a little entranceway, and that particular close runs parallel to where Old Bank Close once stood and is just a few metres up the Royal Mile from it. So let's head along that close and we'll start the story of Rachel Chiesley. Born in 1679, Rachel was the daughter of an infamous murderer. The tale of John Chiesley is one oft told on tours of the more ghoulish and grisly side of Edinburgh's history. When Rachel was only 10 years old, her father filed for divorce to leave behind his wife along with Rachel and her 9 siblings. Now, his case was successful. However, the judge who presided over it, none other than the Lord President of the Court of Sessions, George Lockhart, ordered that John pay a settlement to his family that was much higher than he believed was fair. And in some sort of retribution, he shot and murdered the offending man the following Easter. Now, Chiesley was hanged for his crime, however not before he was tortured and had his right hand and arm severed. And in the years that followed, reports of his ghost with its missing limb terrorised the citizens of Edinburgh. Growing up with the knowledge of her father's deeds and with the eyes of the city on her and her family must have coloured Rachel's life and left a lasting impression. Certainly, she never really managed to fit into the role that she was supposed to play. When Rachel married to another judge, no less, James Erskine Lord Grange, in 1707, she was already pregnant by him. He had been attracted by her beauty, but did not evidently have noble intentions towards her. In fact, he only proposed, it was later reported, when she threatened him. Apparently a pistol was mentioned, and she reminded him that her father had murdered one of his own profession. He, for that very reason, was perhaps concerned that marrying her might compromise his career. Despite this, Rachel recorded that the first 25 years of their marriage were extremely loving and happy. Later reports from other sources, however, record that she herself was quite obnoxious, loud, uncouth, and a heavy drinker. Whether these qualities were attributed to her or perhaps exaggerated in hindsight with a view to excusing her ill treatment is difficult to know. By 1730, though, things were definitely no longer rosy in the Grange household. James was spending much of his time with various mistresses, and Rachel was, in fact, now aligning a lot more with those unflattering descriptions of her. Which was the catalyst for the other? It's difficult to say, but certainly their respective behaviours sent them into a rather terrible, vicious spiral. At this time, in 1730, they separated, and they lived at this point next door to each other in Nidries Wynd, close to the Cowgate. Now, Nidries Wynd again does not exist anymore, but the road that we're standing in at the moment is Nidries Street, which runs parallel to where Nidries Wynd once ran, and it's just very close by. The Cowgate is that rather noisy and busy road down at the bottom there that we can see. So they were living in separate homes, but next to each other, very close to this spot. And Rachel was also taken away from the duties that she had assumed in the other family home, which was Preston House out in East Lothian. No one seemed to bat an eyelid at James's philandering, despite the fact that he put up one of his mistresses, Fanny Lindsay, in luxury in London, and seemed to spend far more of his time there than he did in either of his Scottish homes. However, he was engaged in activities that, were they to be known about, would have caused far more of a stir. He was holding Jacobite meetings at Preston House. Now, James's brother John, the Earl of Mar, had led the Jacobite uprising of 1715 on behalf of the Old Pretender, the man who Jacobites believed should be King James VIII and III. James Erskine, despite his high-ranking establishment position, was holding meetings that could have him accused of treason. Rachel found out about her husband's secret and even claimed to have a letter to prove it. She was making a lot of noise, both literally and metaphorically, around the city, and James and his co-conspirators needed to silence her. The action that they took was vicious and brutal. On the 22nd of January 1732, Rachel was kidnapped, never to see freedom again during the 13 remaining years of her life. Roughly handled so that some of her hair and teeth were pulled out during the struggle, she was bundled into a sedan chair and taken north into the Highlands. Her husband must have called on all sorts of supporters amongst the clans, as she was handled by different people along her long and terrible journey, at one point held in a windowless room for a couple of weeks. Eventually, she found herself on a boat, transported to a remote island to be held in isolation for what must have felt like forever. Where and who her captor was remained a mystery to her, but we know that she was held for 2 years on what are now known as the Monarch Islands in the Western Isles by Alexander MacDonald, the tacksman for Sir Alexander MacDonald of Slate. In June 1734, Norman MacLeod arrived and transported her again. She was told she was being taken to the Orkney Islands, but instead they took her further out into the Atlantic to St Kilda. Here she was left on the tiny island of Herta. She was amongst the locals, but she spoke none of the only language they had, which was Gaelic. She lived in a cleat, a small stone-built hut with earthen floor, with walls that let the winter snow in. She ate as the islanders did, a diet including gannet. The island would have provided an almost unbearable change in circumstances for a lady used to the fine living of Edinburgh. She was left there for at least 6 years. Throughout her entrapment on Herta, the only person she was able to fully communicate with was the local minister, Roderick MacLennan. He managed to smuggle out some letters from her, which eventually in 1740 found their way to her lawyer. The story of her captivity and the treatment she had been subject to made its way around Edinburgh. A rescue party departed for St Kilda. However, by the time they arrived, Erskine's men had taken her away again. Via more islands and Assynt on the mainland, she eventually ended up in a remote spot on the Waternish Peninsula of Skye. There are differing stories as to the condition she found herself in here. Now in her 60s, many believe the next 18 months of her life was spent living in a cave. In May 1745, she died in Trumpen on Waternish and was buried there. The gravestone there with her name, however, was only erected more than a century later, and it is unknown if it is in the correct place. After her death, James wasted little time marrying Fanny Lindsay. Just a couple of months after Rachel's death, and only about 30 miles to the south of where she had been held on the Monarch Islands, in July 1745, Charles Edward Stuart landed on the island of Eriskay. The son of James, whom the Jacobites believed should be King James VIII and III, he had grown up in Italy and never set foot in Britain. His arrival marked the beginning of the final Jacobite campaign, which was aimed at putting his father on the throne and is often referred to as the 45. Charles, more popularly known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, soon continued to mainland Scotland and raised his standard at Glenfinnan, calling his supporters to rally behind him. One person in particular who turned up at Glenfinnan that September day was Jenny, or Jean, Cameron of Glendessery. Jenny had travelled from her Highland home just a few miles to the north, little knowing that she was soon to become beloved of Jacobite supporters, but notorious amongst those who opposed the cause. As the campaign gathered momentum, so did Jenny's infamy. It was soon being said of her that she had arrived at Glenfinnan leading a contingent of 300 men, that she fought at the front of battles whilst outfitted in male attire, and it was even claimed that she had become the lover of Charles Edward Stuart himself. He was 24 years old at the time, while she was in her 40s. Of course, had the age difference been the opposite way around, presumably it would not have been considered a problem. In reality, it appears that there were a few Jean or Jenny Camerons who actively supported the Jacobite cause. They seem to have become confused and conflated by those in opposition in order to have a female figure on whom they could project their hateful views and fears of Highland, and especially Jacobite women. The popular anti-Jacobite press found in Jenny someone about whom they could tell stories intended entirely to titillate and shock their readership. They claimed that whilst she had grown up in Glendessery, by the time she was 11 she was running so wild that her parents were forced to send her down here to Edinburgh to live with an aunt. By the time she was in her late teens, it was said that she was spending an awful lot of time with her aunt's servants, in particular one of the footmen. And with this footman, she would dress up in men's clothing, and the two of them would go to the local brothels, where both would engage the ladies' services. Despite this, they claimed that she got pregnant by the footman and terminated the pregnancy. When news of this got back up home to her family, the shock of it evidently killed her father. After this, they said she was sent over to France to go and be in a monastery, but she engaged in duels over there, so more male-type behaviour, and got pregnant again, this time by one of the monks. So she once again terminated the pregnancy, but was pregnant again fairly soon after by an Irishman. She had this child, but when the Irishman suggested that the two of them return to Scotland, she evidently happily left the child there and returned with him. After getting back to Scotland and home to the Highlands, it was claimed that she was even found in bed with her own brother. So they really did not hold back. And of course, many of the stories that they told revealed what we now can clearly see to be their own homophobia, transphobia, even a bit of classism thrown in there too. And of course, heaps and heaps of misogyny in the idea that women really should not have control and autonomy of their own bodies. So we can see all of that today. At the time, these were all things designed to push the buttons of the 18th century readers of the popular press. Whether the readers of these broadsides believed any of their lurid soap opera is hard to say. However, it certainly ensured they were well versed in the types of behaviour the government soldiers were supposedly fighting to eradicate in the Highlands. Charles Edward Stuart's Jacobite campaign ended with the massacre that was known as the Battle of Culloden on the 16th of April 1746. After that, the Duke of Cumberland, who had been Charles Edward Stuart's adversary on the battlefield, sent his troops through the Highlands, raping and murdering, trying to subdue the Highlanders who, in their mind, were synonymous with the Jacobite cause and therefore with treason. Anybody who had their name connected with that cause, of course, had a price on their heads, and that included Jenny Cameron. So the Duke of Cumberland probably could not believe it, that when he was staying a few months later at Stirling Castle, he heard the news that Jenny Cameron was nearby. He promptly had her arrested, and she was brought here to Edinburgh Castle, where she was imprisoned for 9 months, alongside a number of other Jacobite women, or at least a Jenny Cameron was. So is this Jenny Cameron of Glendessery? Well, it seems probably not, because the reports that we have of her do not put her anywhere near Edinburgh Castle here after the 45. Instead, she evidently bought up land near to East Kilbride, on the west side of Scotland, land that is known even today as Mount Cameron, and lived out the rest of her life there, dying in the 1770s. During her time there, she was reported to be a highly respected and very respectable woman. She adopted many orphans of the 45 and even started a school. So we're seeing in her in a very different light than she was portrayed by that popular press. But if it was not Jenny Cameron who was here at Edinburgh Castle, who was it who was imprisoned within this mighty fortress? Well, we're back here on the Lawn Market where we started our tour, and that's because there is a version of events that says that the Jenny Cameron who was incarcerated in Edinburgh Castle was in fact a milliner who had a shop here on this section of the Royal Mile. Said that after she was released, she returned to her business and it thrived. It seems that the women of Edinburgh were very keen to buy their hats and ribbons from the one-time supposed lover of Bonnie Prince Charlie. So there we have the story of two very different women, but both of whom faced character assassinations, followed by a spell of imprisonment for entirely political reasons. It would be nice to think that nearly 300 years later, we've moved on from all that. Thank you very much again for tuning in. See you next time.